Welcome, everyone. This is the OIS Year in Review podcast for a change. I get to interview three of our hosts today. We have Firas Rahal, who is a well-respected retina surgeon, also a managing partner with Excite Ventures. Also have Rob Rothman, who's a local friend on Long Island, also glaucoma specialist and a partner with InFocus Capital. And then we have Dr. San Sadri, who is in Newport Beach, California, the founder of Visionary Eye Institute and also a founding partner of Visionary Ventures. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today on a Sunday morning, no less, to take a look at the year in review data that we pulled together with the help of some of our good friends at Piper Sandler, Regulatory Pathways Group, GRA Group, the US FDA, and the National Eye Institute. So just real quickly, wanted to get some thoughts from each of you on, at a high level, on some of the data. We'll just run through the presentation. Everyone will have the opportunity to download these slides and go through it on their own, but thought it'd be interesting to get perspectives from our hosts today, being that you're all physicians and involved in funding startups.
It's an honor to be here with Rob and Firas. For me personally, it's a learning opportunity for me. I don't dive too much into the retina, so I'm really curious about what Firas is going to teach me today. So I'm humbled and thankful. It's been a great, weird year for us. With us, all three of us see patients still, and it's good to see everybody back in, at the academy, at least in person. And I'm glad things will open up. And I'm glad you're doing this because I think it serves a lot of purpose for a lot of folks that, probably don't know as much data as my brothers here as far as the venture groups go. But, it's an honor to be here. For me personally, what you're saying with this slide is basically what we're just talking about is, your NEI basic research funding is strong, it's steady. And then we were talking offline about how private funding is probably just as strong, but much bigger as a pie. And so for me personally, what this means is ophthalmology research and venture group is continuous and it's exciting. And I think there's a lot more investments coming.
Cool. Well, now let's take a look real quick at some of the venture funding activity. So, lots of deals, still, more so in pharma, which is no surprise than med tech, but there's a lot of money being put to work in a number of companies. We'll look a little bit later at like what phase of development they're at with their clinical trials. So,
Craig, it's also important to realize. Yeah, it's also important to realize when you look at the slide that there's just a small segment of what's actually been funded, right? There are dozens or maybe even hundreds of additional companies that are not listed on the slide who have received funding. Not only from the three groups that are represented on this call, but from other sources of capital. These are the large, VC deals that have occurred. But, InFocus, for example, has, 13 portfolio assets that are not represented up there at all, that are, some of them are clinical stage at the moment, and some of them are generating revenue and whatnot. And I think the size of the deals will change. I know the investments from Visionary and Excite, and, we've all taken, swings on different levels of funding. So this slide is just a tiny fraction of what's actually been funded over the course of the year. And another point just to make so that everybody knows, it is a Sunday and Firas is not actually working, even though he's in the office. Just making sure people know that.
No, I'm always
he's going to make the rest of us look very bad, but so just clearly.
The next retinal detachment is right around the corner. You never know. So I'm always working. Actually, Rob, I sit here 7 days a week just waiting for them to come in. I don't even
Fantastic.
And it's not, I appreciated your comment. I appreciated your comment about I don't delve too deep in the retina. I was thinking as a clinician, as a surgeon, this is a good thing for you. You don't want to be delving too deep back there when you're taking out your cataracts and stuff.
Correct.
The only comment here I would say is, to Rob's point, I think you have a lot of other activities, but I think this is a good slide. It kind of talks about what are some of the salient things that have occurred. I can only comment on myopia management that we led a deal in Syndexa, here based in San Diego, and I think we'll talk about it later, but myopia and presbyopia, those are the big sort of unmet needs in our field for right now, at least when it comes to anterior segment. So, there's a tremendous amount of activity. You can kind of see this, the competitors of, AbbVie, presbyopia correction here. So you can see that the takeaway for me in this slide is there's multiple partners and competitors in spaces that are unmet, and there's plenty of business for everybody.
Yeah, I agree. And there also to add to that, another sort of broad statement that shows the diversity here of different companies, different concepts. You see how fertile the ophthalmology space is. You have everything from dry eye to devices for diagnosis to gene therapies and regenerative medicine in the posterior segment to even a device that creates an eye drop more effectively. The types of investment in ophthalmology are vast and diverse, and strangely enough, you can diversify within such a narrow scope of ophthalmology reasonably well as an investor, early, late, mid, in staging, and all these different parts of the eyes and all these diagnostics and therapeutics. And here you see that there's a wide range here of different disciplines.
Yeah, and not to harp, and I'm sure that both Firas and Hassan have been through this, is, especially from the venture capital funding level, you have 3 funds that are represented here that are ophthalmically focused, right? Pretty much solely ophthalmically focused. And one of the comments that was, came up regularly during our discussion with limited partners was ophthalmology is too narrow. You're going to do a fund just on the eye. That's way too narrow. And there couldn't be something more, untrue as an investment target. When you look at ophthalmology, there are so many different opportunities to provide improved and disruptive care in ophthalmology because there are so many distinct disease states, so many therapeutic challenges that have to be solved. And if you just look at the amount of dollars, contributed at these larger VC opportunities, and then add all of the, earlier stage investment, there are so many unmet needs in the treatment of this tiny little organ in our body that I think all of us would agree that this is so far from narrow. It's the opposite. It's hard to differentiate sometimes and distinguish all of the opportunities when you're thinking just about one disease, macular degeneration, and you think about how many different opportunities and different ways there are to try and address both wet and dry macular degeneration and all the drug therapies and all the potential targets. It's incredible how much opportunity there is for funding in ophthalmology.
I would make one more comment. I'll be remiss from a couple of colleagues on this slide. Surface, Cameron, I don't know if you know Husseini, he's a CEO, serial entrepreneur. We were also, investors in that. That's mostly a dry eye anti-inflammatory play. And, I agree with Rob. I mean, it's a huge but small sort of market. In other words, it's a big, I think it was north of $50 billion annual. And I think it's just growing. I think there's a tremendous amount of appetite for the ophthalmic space. And I think personally, and I think you guys would agree, it's the renaissance of ophthalmology right now. I mean, if we think about the last 5 years and what's going to be on the horizon, it's tremendous. It's very exciting, very exciting.
Well, to that point, I mean, the public seems to continue to have an appetite as well, right, for ophthalmology technologies. Right?
Yeah, I think it's the same concept that we brought up before, which is that the population is getting older. Eye disease is becoming more prevalent. Incidence of disease is increasing. As a glaucoma specialist, the general commentary is that only half the people who have glaucoma are currently diagnosed and treated. So you think about how much more, healthcare money is going to need to be spent on some of these diseases. That I think the search for better outcomes, improved technology, things that improve quality of life for patients overall is going to be growing, not shrinking. And if you look at the diversity of the companies that have, entered the public market, it's a very diverse space. And I think that we, all recognize the fact that there are many, many more companies that will be entering the public space over the next year, and this will continue because there's, as Hassan said, this is a renaissance time. There is so much unbelievable technological and scientific development going on in ophthalmology right now that this is going to be a trend that grows.
To Rob's point, again, there's such a diversity of opportunity. Just on this slide alone, You see Iveric, and there's this entire burgeoning area of dry AMD treatments. And these companies are going public earlier and earlier, because of the appetite for the markets for these kinds of investments. Decades ago, you wouldn't see companies going as early as they do now. You're having biotherapeutics going public in the preclinical stages, which was, I think, unthinkable 20 years ago. And then on the other hand, even within macular degeneration, you have another slide, another section on here, Outlook Therapeutics, a completely different animal than all the others approaching it. They're just figuring out a way to properly ophthalmically package Avastin, an old standby, a stalwart in the treatment of retinal diseases for 16 years. And so almost the opposite than what an Iveric is doing. Iveric's bringing this brand new, incredible science to a disease that's untreatable, and Outlook's bringing a very useful tool to a disease that's being treated now with a drug quite similar to what they're bringing. But again, big appetite for this stuff because the market's huge. And to add to what both guys said earlier, Craig, I think people ought to understand, and I know you do, the public, and this has been shown repeatedly and with a high magnitude, the American public values vision and sight preservation at one of the highest levels, and polls keep showing this, and the CMS studies this, and they decide how they're going to allocate money within CMS. And I think the private funding environment sort of reflective of that. The public wants this.
So I think the fact that these companies have been given the proper guidance that, hey, there's enough appetite in the public market for positive phase 2 data, not only from public offerings, but even significant strategic involvement at the post phase 2 level. That's pretty unusual, and I think it's a telling sign for what ophthalmic innovators can expect going forward, which is that if they can get themselves to a point where they have really solid phase 2 data, that there's a real opportunity for them at that point to create value for investors and bring their product to market. And I think that's the most encouraging thing. And there are a couple of phase 2 exits on this slide, but I think that's the goal. I think as an investor that we look for is, how likely is the funding that we're going to provide for these companies going to get them to a phase 2, data readout, because that's really where we can see true value creation for investors. And I think that this slide sort of proves that.
For me, what I would sort of think about when I see this slide is you're going to see some inhibition from the largest traditional sort of strategics to acquire some of the earlier phase 2 driven companies. So the company has to capitalize either private investors or go public. And that was not the case 10 years ago. In other words, there was the strategics had a big appetite for purchase, and that was the traditional route. It's very rare, to Rob's point, to see a company early try to exit and get capital. But that's been a really nice way to sort of raise money and avoid the trap of not being able to get picked up by a strategic, just because there's fewer strategics out there post mergers.
So that's a perfect segue into M&A activity.
Well, again, you're looking at these high value acquisitions, the price points for some of these, and again, so, going back to the previous slide, like when we discussed the fact that there's an opportunity for inflection at a phase 2 exit, if I was a risk-taking strategic partner, you start to look at the cost that it takes for a company to acquire a phase 3 or a clinical product that's already got revenue. So you look at Ivantis at $475 million. There's a possibility that Alcon had the opportunity to look at that product when it was $150 million, $175 million at an earlier stage. And I think that these companies have, to Hassan's point, lots of cash and the availability to make acquisitions later. And we have to try and understand what their risk appetite is going forward, because it matters when we consider how to fund these companies. Not every small company wants to become a big company. Some of them actually want to be acquired, right? Not every company wants to go out and build a sales force and start selling products. Some of them would like to be, managed by somebody bigger and stronger. So when you look at some of these numbers and you think about at least the disclosed prices, you're not going to see a lot of $6 billion mergers. It doesn't happen that often, in ophthalmology, unless it's a huge, sort of a huge, opportunity, from a market perspective. Most of these companies, I think, again, at the strategic level, have a desire and have proven that they have the need to have both an early, a mid, and a late stage life cycle when it comes to product development. what I hope we're going to see is that they start to look at companies and acquisitions that meet all of those demands, that they're not just going to be doing the post-market $500 million acquisitions, that they'll make some earlier investments, look at companies at an earlier stage that are promising, that meet their specific internal and undisclosed mandates for market segment that they're looking to attack. And that we'll start to see that activity happening. And I think it will, just because there is such a huge availability of it's a target rich environment for them right now, right? There are so many high quality targets out there that we can't imagine that they're just going to not start to take things earlier, acquire them earlier, bring them in-house, or let them be developed externally in a partnership. But it's great to see that they've engaged in these later stage deals. I think that will continue to happen. But I think that you're going to see a lot of funding happening at an earlier stage as well.
As far as acquisitions,
I'll make a comment here too. I think Rob's point is really good, but I would also say that the strategics now are sort of buying the revenue. If you look at Omidria, that's just announced just last week from Rayner, that's a really good partnership, because Rayner is traditionally in the OR. If you look at their IOL platforms, it's mostly OUS, some in the US activity now. They've done direct and also indirect distributorships here in the US. But Omidria, that's a big price tag. And let's face it, if Omidria didn't have any recurrent revenue and proper CMS regulatory pathways, that number would be much lower. So to me, if you're listening to this and you're sort of in the startup world, the sooner you can sort of help commercialize and create revenue, the higher your valuation is going to be of your company. And I think that's a take-home message here.
Great. So let's scroll through we'll start getting into regulatory approvals. So this year, not so much on the 510K side. There was Omni Surgical Systems was the only thing I think that really stood out, because it granted specific labeling for IOP reduction, whereas previously it was just a tool.
The thing I would say there is, if you compare this slide to the one previous, the revenue stream comes from basically getting products approved. So the 510K model or strategy is actually a pretty rapid strategy. In other words, it's a lot to do with how quickly you can come to market and create revenue. So I think the salient point here for this slide is there's going to be other companies that follow the Sight Sciences pathway in this space. I know a few, and I think that's that. And the reason there is because the 510K pathway is fast, but also if you're a company and you're going to use 510K, I think it'd be really good to already have reimbursement in place, because if you have reimbursement in place, then you're going to be very attractive. So not only do you have a product in the marketplace quickly, but you also have reimbursement for the doctor to actually get paid. And then you're going to have revenue stream almost quickly and very quickly. And so the strategics will look at you. And as you saw earlier, that's where your value add is. And that's how you get those big pops.
Right. And that's also, again, from the investment side, Hassan, you're correct. Having a predicate device where you can 510K off of that, speeds up the development. And if you think about the way ophthalmic development, and probably this exists outside the world, although I don't care about anything but ophthalmology, but ultimately, there's this stepwise sort of logical development process that occurs where things build on each other, right? There's clinical improvements, there's technological improvements. 510K is designed to allow somebody else's prior safety data to serve, for your benefit, because you're saying, hey, we're not substantially different with regard to what we do. And this is why we believe that pathway is viable. And I think the FDA's ability to process that has been unbelievably helpful, right? It is this new collaborative approach I think the FDA has taken towards trying to make sure things get to market at an appropriate time. And I think that's been helpful. So Sight Sciences was certainly the beneficiary of that. And ultimately the difficulty for investors is trying to not think about not always what's the next incremental thing, but what's going to be 3 steps down the road. And does it make sense? And you're right, for entrepreneurs or startups who may be listening to this, it's important to understand, the people that came before you and determine whether or not what you're doing is going to be acceptable and fit into the model of, incremental growth over time. Except for something, let's say like dry AMD, where we've never really had any therapy. Almost everything's going to build off somebody else, right? Somebody is the first gene therapy, and then everybody else is going to get the benefit of gene therapy. Someone's going to tackle the suprachoroidal space, and everybody will get the benefit of that. And there's only one of those, but many that can follow.
NDA BLA approval. So this I actually had to get from Wiley. Anything here you guys think about?
For me, this was just mentioned, actually. There's a couple of things in the posterior segment here that are important, and people have been waiting for some of this to start coming online. You have here the Xipere, which is, it's just a steroid, but the point with Clearside and what they've done is, and Rob just alluded to this incidentally, they're opening up this avenue to deliver drugs and products into the suprachoroidal space in the office. It remains to be seen what's going to be the long-term or even short-term role for that, because all the therapies that are being considered for it are still in flux also. It's now something that's being used to deliver gene therapy, which makes a lot of sense, but this has generally historically been a space we tend to avoid as retina surgeons. We don't necessarily want to be there, but if you can be there in a controlled manner, there's promise for simplifying what will be coming. Not so much the steroid, I think that's wonderful, but we already deliver lots of steroids in lots of ways, but this anatomic technique is looking like it may end up having great relevance in the more complex delivery of regenerative medicine and so forth. And the other thing that stands out for me, and I'm not going to try to pronounce the name yet, I continue to call it the PDS, or Port Delivery System. Roche has been working on this for many years. I know the history of who developed it and so forth, but I think the point to me about Port Delivery System is this is the first of probably many drug delivery conceptualizations. This was one of the first conceptualizations from many years ago, long before Roche was developing it, which is essentially a depot kind of concept for intravitreal therapy. We've all wanted such a thing. I think how much market penetration there will be for this is, I don't think it's anyone's guess. I think it'll be relatively low. It's a great device and it adds to the armamentarium, but this has become a fairly consistent office-based therapy that we do a lot of, and we've done tens of millions of injections around the world. And although patients might be frustrated by that, the older people who are in this population are a little bit reluctant to go to the OR, and their doctors are reluctant to take them to the OR. I will use this technique, but I think that the percentage of the market that will go to this, I think, will probably be small, but significant and very useful for those people that do go for it.
I would comment here, a couple of things from my standpoint is that's pretty intriguing. You've got the dry eye and presbyopia. So presbyopia, as you all know, is probably, arguably next to myopic degeneration, probably the largest unmet need in the world. In the US, there's about 128 million Americans that suffer from presbyopia. So you'll see some sort of, rendition of pilocarpine or combo pilocarpine sort of therapies. AbbVie is just approved and now in the marketplace. Actually, I had a patient yesterday who somehow got their hands on a bottle from CVS and brought it and showed it to me, which is kind of cool. So for those people listening, don't know what presbyopia is. Basically, you're cheaters. That's like me. I'm getting old and I can't see, and everyone comments on my font on my iPhone. So I'm actually really excited about this personally, just because I think there's, even though there's about, I think now 8 competitors in this space, the market is huge. And I think it'll change the landscape for us cataract refractive surgeons, just because the reality of people are going to come in and not everyone's going to be a candidate for this type technology, but it'll just kind of create that awareness and that discussion points for people to come in. So that's the first one I'm really excited about. Obviously the spray, and you've got Oyster Point, and there's a lot of data there. We can talk a lot about that, but that's kind of another intriguing dry eye therapies that have hit the market. So patients have choices, and that's really exciting. I think there's a lot more to come, that's going to be coming behind that. And I think the reality of it is that we were talking about earlier, ophthalmology is going through a renaissance right now. And I think there's a tremendous amount of capital internationally too. So, companies like OIS based in Israel, that's another competitor that's probably going to come out in the marketplace. And I think there's plenty of room for everybody. I think that's what's exciting about this.
I have a question for you, actually, for us. I think it's important to discuss here too, because I think, at least for the investment community, it's critical to understand this. The FDA has generally made it clear that they're less fond of approving products that offer patient convenience, right? They really don't want to fund convenience, or they don't want to approve convenience. So is this product, or in your opinion, is this product going to provide better outcome for patients? Obviously, the FDA agrees that it will. And do you think that there's an important, that it's important to consider commentary for the FDA when you're an early, or let's say startup company, regarding their attitude towards what they approve and what they don't want to approve going forward? Because this is one of those where, as a glaucoma person, I'm like, wow, it's great. You can implant something and only inject or fill it. Let's say, it's a surgical procedure, maybe a relatively mild surgical procedure. And then maybe people only need two, applications of drug over the course of a year, rather than an injection every, let's say, 6 or 7 weeks. Is that really something that we're going to continue to see coming through, in your opinion, down the road? Or are we going to start to see the FDA push back a little bit and saying, well, we don't necessarily want to see you inject less frequently, we want to see better outcomes?
It's a great question. It's been discussed a lot, and out of interest, I asked Dr. Chambers this on a podium not that long ago, and the answer was, we need to see better outcomes, at least party line type answer. But there's some subtlety and nuance there. So the patient convenience factor, I think, will continue, from what I'm hearing, to not be enough, to your point. But in the real world, and this is where the FDA has to kind of have an open mind of how to measure what are real world outcomes versus clinical trial outcomes. If you compare a convenient treatment, so to speak, to monthly anti-VEGF therapy, then yeah, it's a high bar. Where this product and other drug delivery products will improve outcomes and not just enhance, say, quality of life or convenience, is that people really don't get monthly anti-VEGF therapy in the real world. That ends up becoming a very small minority of patients. So if you can provide 2 injections a year, let's say, and get that person a year of continuous therapy, the equivalent of 12 monthly injections, in a really high-level clinical trial, that might be maybe looked at as non-inferior. But in the real world, it's clearly superior, because we have all these shortfalls in the monthly injection regimen, and everyone talks about this. Probably less than 10% of people actually get that kind of therapy, for 1,000,001 reasons that are outside the scope of this discussion. But if you use real-world comparators, I think these, at least for wet AMD and diabetic macular edema, anti-VEGF therapy, these convenience products, being drug delivery, are actually going to result in better real-world outcomes for the overwhelming majority of patients.
Yeah, and I agree. I think Susvimo has actually sort of paved the way a little bit for how we're going to be looking at or evaluating opportunities in the drug delivery space, because it really is going to be required that there's some benefit, and whether you have to discuss that with the FDA in advance of your clinical trial and how you assess improved outcome. I think it's an interesting time for drug delivery based on Susvimo's approval.
The agency will, as you just implied, I think we'll have to figure out ways to evaluate real life outcomes. If your control group in the clinical trial is monthly anti-VEGF, and it should be, that's what's approved, and that only represents somewhere under 10% of patients in real world, even in the US, then you have to find a way to find the comparator group that looks a lot more like the real world. And then you can see if these products are not only showing convenience for all parties, but also improved efficacy. And that's still being determined, I think, at the agency level or as a country. We have to figure that out.
Let's face it, the US is much slower and much more costly than other parts of the world. When we go to these European meetings, I always feel like, wow, we're, as clinicians, it's very frustrating because we don't have all the tools, even though we lead in ophthalmic investments and really the knowledge, the pipeline of entry for patients here in the US is cumbersome, and it needs to change, and it needs to get, basically the bureaucracy needs, in my opinion, cut down. And I think this is a good testimony to that. And I think kudos to the guys in Verana for doing that, and I'm proud of them.
Yeah, and again, just in the final comment, it's a shout out to our government, right? I mean, we're so used to bad mouthing everything we could do, but the reality is that even though the IRIS registry, I think, was originally created to figure out if they're going to overpay or underpay us in the long term, how well are we doing regarding the achievement of certain clinical benchmarks, which was really the purpose, I think, of the IRIS registry, was to find out if we're compliant. And I think for the early days of reporting, for all of us who were involved in that, having to put down what your visual acuity outcomes were pre-cataract, post-cataract, and all of this stuff, I think the motivation for it was maybe misguided to some degree, but ultimately it's provided this just unprecedented set of information. And I believe that ophthalmology is really the first specialty to have such a robust, data pool for use for many, many good things, not just necessarily figuring out, if we're being overpaid or underpaid, but just the determination of quality and, outcomes, and the measurement tools that have been implemented in IRIS has really just been unbelievably groundbreaking. And, for the AAO and for the feds who helped propagate this, it's a real big win for ophthalmology in general. I think it's going to make, again, bringing it back to investment, I think it's going to make the ability to identify high quality ophthalmic technologies for both investment purposes and the benefit of patients down the road is going to be fundamentally improved by the utilization of what Verana and the IRIS registry are going to bring to the research world. So
that's great. Thank you all for sharing your insights on this. In summary, what I wanted to make note of is that, we're still in a pandemic, right? And yet it has not stalled innovation. At the onset of this, it was like everybody was asking questions like, we didn't know how this was going to impact clinical trials immediately, right? And then funding. Like, a lot of VCs that I was talking to were like, they weren't writing any new checks initially, until we really got our arms around this. And so it's reassuring, though, to see that, it did not stall innovation. We're back up and running, and I feel optimistic about it going forward. I think things will just continue to get better. I wanted to get your thoughts. Any closing statements from each of you?
I think I'll echo your point there, and maybe just add to it. The fact that we came through, especially the early part of the pandemic, pretty quickly in ophthalmology and ophthalmology innovation and development, I think speaks to both sides. On one side of the equation, as we mentioned earlier, the patient and national interest and demand in quality ophthalmic care is high, really high, and that's a driver. And then on the other side, I'll give a lot of credit to our colleagues in ophthalmology. The brain power and the innovation is on that side is also very high. So when you combine those two things, the great demand from the public and the great minds creating new treatments on the ophthalmology innovation side, I think that explains how we came through very shortly the pandemic so well.
Yeah, and I'll fire off, and I think that, look, there was maybe, and again, speaking from the personal perspective of our own portfolio, we saw some companies that were engaged in clinical trials have some minor slowdowns in patient recruitment, which would be expected. But ultimately, nobody got derailed. And I think that, Craig, everybody on this podcast today has interviewed people on behalf of OIS where we've asked that question. And I think at every level of ophthalmology, you've seen that there has been very little disruption overall to ophthalmic development. It's created probably a significant increase in the sideline capital and dry powder available for entities to invest in ophthalmology. I think it's helped sort of push maybe a little bit more of a sort of faster look at telehealth and at some of the technologies to allow the practice of ophthalmology to occur remotely, because we've seen that this is not going to be the last time we have a pandemic, and we're aware that we're going to have episodes in the future where we're going to have less access to our patients. But the bottom line is ophthalmology's come out of this stronger than it was before. Significant funding significant public, market activity in terms of IPOs and mergers. And again, as Faraz and Hassan both said, there was just a significant push towards better, eye care. The public values this highly, is willing to spend money on it. They don't pay the doctors, but besides that, they're willing to fund the development of products, and at least at the investment level, understand that improving eye care and producing better outcomes is critical for the health of our country and the world in general. And I think we'll continue to see that the dollars, sort of prove that going forward.
I would say that, echo what Rob and Faraz was saying. What we're really saying all along on this call, on this podcast is, if you're an entrepreneur out there, you have a great idea. This is the time in ophthalmology. This is the Renaissance time. It doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna get funded, but this is a really kind of a testimony to, an idea, a dream that the entrepreneur had, and with the proper diligence and hard work and possible a lot of failure, you can get investors to invest in your idea and go public. And you see it all the time. And this is probably one of the only countries in the world you can do that. And it's just so great to be part of this and be with colleagues that are, just tour de force, both clinicians, but also improving the landscape. Just been an honor to be with you guys today. And just really, we're very blessed and thankful to be part of as an ophthalmologist and seeing patients every day and having the resources here in this country to provide the best eye care, world-class eye care. And, we see patients from around the world that come to our clinics, and this is the reason, the core of why they come is because of the innovation and the innovation support that we have in this country. So great things are going to come in 22, and I look forward to doing this again with you guys next year. And I wish you guys and the families and everybody a wonderful thing. Craig, thank you for hosting this. I know it's a lot of work. I know you're working really hard out in Florida right now. It's tough work that you're doing. Well, we love you, brother. We love you.
Thank you.
And Craig, just one final. I mean, look, we just as for you, I guess, we appreciate the opportunity to do this. I think that the four of us on this podcast maybe equal 1/3 of an Emmett Cunningham brain. Like maybe that's correct, right? Like maybe. And Emmett's really been the template for this for many, many years. Has been the face of this for many, many years. And obviously, special thanks to him for, recruiting all of us to get involved over the years and laying the foundation for this. But, I think having the year in review and allowing 3 physicians who are also investors have the opportunity to comment on this stuff is great. And I certainly appreciate always speaking to Hassan and Faraz, and I think that it's great they have the perspectives of 3 different clinical specialties, but 3 very similar venture capital funds that are all focused on improving ophthalmology for patients in the United States and across the world. Is a great perspective for this, and it's a privilege to have been a part of it, and thank you for the opportunity and for including me.
Yeah, no, the feelings are mutual. I couldn't continue to push forward without you guys, and so hopefully next year we'll have some of our own data to use for the year in review. We do still have the ideal source in development. It's about 80% complete. So we'll be releasing a lot of information on startups and their stage of development. We're going to be tracking that. And then we have a fairly extensive list of active investors in the space as well. So hopefully we'll be able to use this product as a means to help facilitate, even more investment and connections. So stay tuned for that. And hopefully for a live OIS in the spring of 2022 as well. So gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. Happy holidays to the 3 of you. And I'll leave it to the 3 of you going forward to be the podcast hosts. I'll stay behind the scenes going forward, but this was fun to do this with the 3 of you today. So again, thank you. And I hope you have a wonderful end of year holidays and a happy new year.